Hi, I'm Simon Wood, and I'm interviewing Distinguished Guest of Honor for Bouchercon 2020, Anne Perry. Welcome, Anne.
Thank you very much.
I just want to ask you, how does it feel to be a Distinguished Guest of Honor?
Oh, it's very nice. To be honored by anybody is important, but to be honored by other writers who know exactly what is involved, that's the big one.
I've always wanted to be the dubious guest of honor myself, but hopefully that'll come in time. The big thing I wanted to ask you first, going into the questions that I put together, is basically why historicals? I couldn't find that you've ever written anything contemporary.
I haven't, except the odd short story.
Yeah.
I suppose because I think, in a way, you can make present day commentary on whatever social ills you believe passionately. Most people have something that they care about, and you set it back a little bit. You can write it very plainly, and people say, "Oh, isn't that dreadful? Thank goodness we don't do that, or do we?" And you can show it very clearly without seeming to be preaching, which is so boring, and yet you can still get the message across. And history is wonderful. It's full of all sorts of exciting visuals and feelings and thoughts, and you can play fast and loose with it a bit more than you can with present day. And present day dates. History's dated already.
So I was going through all your books and different series, and I thought it was interesting because you don't like say stick with say Victorian. You've like bounced up and down through the centuries, and I want to know, why those particular points in history? Was there a particular reason?
Well, the Victorian history, I think, is far enough away that it can be exotic. It's not familiar. If you can't make a romantic, exciting story out of carriages and gas lamps and cobbled streets, then you aren't trying. And it's a time of great contrasts between poverty and wealth, as there still is, but it's still close enough that we can identify with it. It's not so far away. My great-grandmother would be Victorian. My grandmother was born then. It's within imagination quite easily, and yet it still is very, very different.
But you've gone through other time periods as well. Was there a reason for those?
Oh yes, they're all exciting. I got stuck with Victorian because the publisher said yes instead of no. And that'll answer any question you've got. Yes, let's have another one. Certainly, right here. So I do like it because it's a buoyant period when we really believed in ourselves. We thought anything was possible.
I always do wonder because my background is engineering, and the technology of, say 1850s through to the, when Victoria died in 1901, there's a massive jump. And then there's a massive jump by World War One, and then by World War Two. They're almost unrecognizable worlds.
Yes, it is. And yet, in the Victorian time, I've never run it down any further, but they had electric corsets.
No, that's frightening.
Isn't it though? But it was a time of innovation and belief in ourselves. And we need a little more of that. We have to go back, I think, before World War One, which also is a time period that fascinates me, because a year ago, we would all have asked ourselves, if I was alive when we faced an Armageddon period, how would I react? Well, this year we're finding out, but until then, it was another world. I think World War One is sort of the end of history and the beginning of the present day.
Well, that sort of opens up now. Is obviously we're just over 100 years between now and the Spanish flu. Is there an opportunity for you to write something about the Spanish flu era that will mimic essentially what's happening now? Because there's a lot.
Except that we know about the things. Well, we know truth and we know other than the truth. I find it so depressing to think of a pandemic, whether it was Spanish flu or the bubonic plague or whatever. It's too real now to write about it as a commentary. What I am doing, and this is not a shameless piece of self-promotion, it's just I've got a passion about the 1930s. And I've got a new series I've started. I've just finished the third one. it's a female lead, which I usually do male, but she's a spy and she sees Europe in the 1930s. And that is so much of a commentary on today. We're driving like mad into a terrible era. And it does mimic the 30s when we knew so much about what was going on in Germany, and yet we still managed to deceive ourselves into being, oh no, it'll never happen here. And of course,
Yeah. I always wonder if that's the thing, that we don't want to face the truth or deal with it, so we kind of pretend, oh no, it will never get any worse than it is, or
yes,
it'll go away.
do. And all the time we think, well, he's not really that bad, reference Hitler. Oh yes, he is. And the one I've just finished, and I mean just finished, about a couple of weeks ago, the heroine finds out that she got within her own family Hitler sympathizers, and she has to face the fact that they really do genuinely believe that this is an acceptable way to deal with problems. What do you do if your family's divided down the middle or one person's off, seriously believing what you cannot accept as morally okay? Do you stand by your principles? Do you break from your family? Or do you keep on making excuses for them or try to fit in? It's a timeless question.
Yeah, and it's easy to say, oh, I would do this, but you don't know until you're in that position.
Exactly. Fortunately, my family was on the side that I believed to be right. I can remember World War II. I can remember being bombed.
My mum and dad are a little bit older than you, and
that's a comfort. I thought you were going to say younger.
So my mum, her family stayed in London during the war, but my dad was an evacuee to Somerset. So they've got two very different experiences.
Yes, well, I wasn't evacuated. We were in London all through the Blitz. We lived in Blackheath, just above the Woolwich Arsenal.
Yeah.
Which is a heck of a target.
Yeah, my mum was in Paddington.
Yeah. I don't know how well she remembers it, but I can still remember some of it quite well, because it doesn't matter how small you are if you can sort of see and hear. But I wasn't frightened because I didn't know my parents were frightened. If they were, they hid it so well.
Yeah, that's an interesting question to ask my mum, because she just remembers like almost an adventure at times of like that thing of going down into the underground.
Yes.
And it being kind of like this thing of like, oh, this is kind of, fun.
Alice down the rabbit hole.
Yeah, but then if you having talked to my mum and sort of like having the issues that my grandmother had, you could see that it was starting to break her up towards the end, because she never went down in the into the underground during the bombings, but her dad took them and all the kids down, and she stayed and just carried on like nothing was happening.
That's typically British, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, we lived in London, but we had our own small air raid shelter in the back garden. And I can remember being woken up at night and being cold. But I remember one night where I was staring up at these pretty lights across the sky. And I was like, come on! Because there were tracer bullets from the fighter planes right above our heads, right over the back garden.
Yeah, I have an old work friend who remembers, he was from Liverpool, and he just remembers being sort of like hurried through town as a toddler, as seeing Liverpool docks on fire.
Yes.
And he goes, that hasn't left him, and he must have been only 2 or 3 at the time.
That's to me comforting to hear, because I must have been 2 or 3 a lot of these, and I think, did you really remember it? But yes, but I don't remember being frightened. I remember being constantly cold and very often hungry, but not frightened, because my parents didn't convey fear.
Yeah. What did your parents do?
Oh, my father was a scientific advisor to the Admiralty in the Air Ministry, and my mother was looking after me.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I always wonder what people's, what the parents were doing, because I can imagine everybody trying to.
Well, he went into London every day, but he was doing one of those jobs he doesn't ever discuss.
Yeah.
And my stepbrother, to whom I'm very close to him, he's gone unfortunately, but he knew my father closely more in later life, and he knew a lot more than I knew about what my father did then. Although, let me see, I was an adult before that, before I knew Mike. But he knows quite a lot. Has got some nice stories to tell about how they would say, "What's that chap doing here? He just sits in the corner. What are you paying him for?" And then he worked out something really brilliant, and they said, "That's what we pay him for." Sitting thinking. But it's a background I'm very grateful to have. And I think my mother's quiet courage was what made me have no memory of fear in that time.
That'd be an interesting question to ask other sort of like, if you like, war children,
Yes.
if they felt the same way, if it was that sort of universal thing that people kind of went, because you try and present an image to the kids so they don't have that panic.
I think it's probably quite widespread. Maybe not universal, but quite widespread.
Yeah, because just thinking about, conversations with my mum and dad, I don't ever remember fear being brought up. Especially, it's different for my dad, but my dad was separated from his family for
Yeah,
essentially 7 years.
yeah.
He went
That's,
as a 7-year-old, came back as a 14-year-old, which is that's a massive change in a child's
yeah.
upbringing.
But most of what's in one's past can be used to strengthen you if you try.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think any kind of hardship, certain amounts of it are translatable to another situation. So we can imagine ourselves in a Victorian situation if we try hard enough. There's a lot of commonality between, fear is the same, whatever period of time you live in. Laughter is the same. You may not laugh at the same things, but you understand humor, especially humor in tight corners to get you through. That's why it doesn't matter if you're writing an historical period, the emotions are the same and a lot of values are the same.
Yeah, I tend to write myself. I tend to write something that's more, I won't say general, but I tend to write in a way that I think it doesn't matter where you're from, um, or what age you are. I try to make it relatable, that you should be able to read something into the situation of, this is something that could happen to me. This is something that I fear happening to me, you know.
Oh, that's the essence of writing, surely, that what you say is universal. I'm certainly trying to do that.
There's sometimes you read things where it's not particularly universal, and I think
I
you're
read it for
not
long.
a reader, yeah. But yeah,
It
so
doesn't relate if it's the deepest feelings, I think, are common to all of us. And we all know what it's like to love or to be furious or to be frightened. It doesn't matter what of, the feeling is the same.
yeah,
And I think it's one of the wonderful ways of making any human being accessible to others.
yeah, exactly, yeah.
Because we can only live one life, but we can participate in as many as we can read about.
Hopefully, it brings people together, that everybody sort of like doesn't see everything
Yeah,
in their issue or their problem, and it'll never happen to me. And then it's that thing of like, no, these are universal issues that can
it's the essence
land
of writing. You
love.
put it very well.
Yeah, I always think it's funny if I'm doing like a reader writer sort of like event where you have
Yeah.
interactions and someone says it won't happen to me, and it's like
Wait,
I kind of
wait
think
a
it's like,
while.
well, it hasn't happened yet.
Yes, but if you could across the bridge, maybe you're going over a greater distance and meeting them more on their side this time.
Yeah.
Next time they may meet more on your side. But you can also have experiences which maybe you never will. I can remember reading about, it was a detective story, but the detective was deaf.
Mm.
And I got an insight into deafness that I hadn't even thought about. And another one, which is very interesting, it was a Latino Cuban family in exile in Miami. And the grandparents were always talking about going back, when we go back. And the granddaughter couldn't bring herself to tell them it doesn't exist anymore. in fact, actually, the way you lived never did exist, except at the expense of other people. You
Yeah.
don't tell grandparents that. But it made me very conscious of the age difference a couple of generations could make. A different world. And I think now how different my grandmother's world was from mine, and how different the younger generation is, I can't even explain to them. Don't know where to begin about my childhood growing up. There are people who think Hitler was a fictional character.
Yeah, and I don't, in some ways, that's kind of like a great thing and a terrible thing, because, it's the idea that Hitler is so far divorced from the consciousness that it feels like, oh, it's that guy that was on some documentary or movie they made once, and it's not something everybody can relate to.
And that's frightening. Maybe that's why we keep making the same mistakes over and over.
Yeah, probably.
I remember reading a very interesting speech from a great British Prime Minister about our unpreparedness for war. And I thought, oh, that's Churchill. No, it's not. It must be maybe Lloyd George. It turned out to be William Pitt, the younger. For those who are not familiar with British history, it's not 1939, it's not 1910 or so forth. It was 1800 and something, early 1800s. We don't learn.
I think I heard something similar with a French guy who was putting on Henry V for the first time, and he kind of said he goes, if you look at French military, he goes, well, there was something like, he goes, when they're prepared for World War II, they were basically had the mentality of World War One, and it's that thing of like, oh,
yeah,
it's backtracking all the time and never being ready for the moment, and it was kind of an
we don't learn, do we? But then most of us don't know much history.
Yeah.
And history is just endless stories about people.
That gives me another question then, is there a particular period in time you'd like to tackle that you haven't? Because I know you've hit various time periods in various things, but is there something?
There are two periods. That's a lovely question. I want more of World War One and the 30s particularly, but another period I like very much is the French Revolution, because it seems to me that all revolutions follow a certain pattern and end up by being more extreme than the people they replaced. I mean, Robespierre was more extreme than the French kings. The Russian was more extreme than the people that they threw out. And so it happened with the Iranians. It seems to be a pattern. And the other one is the Spanish Inquisition. Because what's interesting is not the terrible things they did to people, but the feeling that my truth is more important, and if you have to die in order to get my truth, then you're better off than if I let you live without believing the same as I do. Where the hell do you get off deciding that your religion is right and nobody else has the right to think differently? But we do. We don't so much with religion now, but we do with politics.
Well, it's any kind of thing that's going to be an ideology, whether if you want to be exposed to theology.
I'll make you a democracy whether you want it or not. It's good for you.
Well, it always makes you feel like you're coming back to sort of like Animal Farm and all these other allegories.
Yes.
Like follow that thing of the hypocrisy of these kind of, it's kind of interesting. It's great to have ideals, but it's that thing of like, my ideal's so great, you have to believe it too.
Yes, or for your own good, I'll save your soul in spite of burning your body. But it's really, I believe in freedom of speech to a certain level. That becomes a matter when it's hatred, and that's. But even if I don't agree with you, I will defend your right to say it. It's that's easy to say and hard to do.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, but the basic principle, I think there must be a limit to freedom of speech, because it's not all right to slander somebody. It's not all right to yell fire in a crowded theatre, whether it's literally or metaphorically. You are responsible for what you knowingly cause or uncaringly cause. This conversation could go on forever.
Yeah. Oddly enough, I was in a movie theatre where someone shouted fire.
Oh, was it a fire?
Yeah, but no one believed the guy. It was the manager of the movie.
Oh, yeah.
Fire, and everybody's like going, okay. and he's going, fire. And then when the smoke followed him into the room,
Yes. Then everybody
everybody, oh,
scrambled.
okay.
Well, funny, it's difficult to get the right balance between hysteria and apathy.
Yeah, it was kind of like, it was a very English approach. It was kind of like, excuse me, there's a fire. And it's like, what? And it was, fire. And everyone, oh, really?
It is very English, isn't it? Sometimes we could do with a firecracker lit behind us, but not often.
So the next question I wanted to ask you, because you're in that sort of treacherous territory of writing history and historicals and things like, are you tackled by historians or history buffs have called you out on anything?
Once or twice, but very, very rarely. And it was somebody did tell me that I had ladies attending a funeral, and apparently ladies didn't. But doesn't matter. I don't get called out very often. And sometimes one charming gentleman who was an expert on Victorian music hall songs, I did have Charlotte, my heroine in the Pit Stories, singing, having a little too much wine on one occasion, and singing Charlie Is My Darling on the way home. And, she was just a little happy, but I had her sing it 3 months before the song actually came out. Right here, but 3 months early. And I said, thank you so much. And I left it exactly as it was. But he kindly meant, and he sent me we stayed in correspondence for a little while, and he sent me nice bits of information about music hall songs, which I never needed again, but it was just nice.
So where are you doing, if you like, your historical research? How are you getting?
Well, I used to have piles and piles of books. It depends what for. For the World War I series, of which there are 5 books, I actually went to the battlefield, what's left of them, and I went around the Imperial War Museum, and I read lots of letters and things like that. But I don't research most things as closely as that. And as a Brit, you will know that a lot of London is Victorian anyway.
Yeah.
Photographs of the time, a lot, letters. It's amazing how much you can get just from one good photograph. You can get whatever might be the street lighting, the transport, the advertising, the clothes, a lot from one good photograph.
Yeah, I've always thought newspapers are usually quite helpful in that sense. You can.
Yes, they are, especially the London Illustrated News, Illustrated London News, whatever it is. But I think most research is not to put it in, it's so that you don't make a mistake.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, because a mistake will stick out. People like to feel they're there, but a lot of what you do making people feel there is something they would feel anywhere. If you've got a stone in your shoe, it doesn't matter whether you're walking the Great Wall of China or downtown New York, it feels the same.
Yeah, I've always had that thing that I'll spend a week on researching something, and I tend to write contemporary, and then basically all I'll say is like, his sweater was red, and because that's the only thing that needed to be relevant, but I need to check 5 sources to make sure that was right.
Well, you can overload with details that a person doesn't want. And I remember I've got one story set in medieval Byzantium, and I researched the streets and what was in the shops, and they had pretty good shopping streets there in the 1270s, I think it was, and it was all edited out. Nobody wants to know. They want to know what's happened to your characters. And they took about a third of the book away. And I think as far as making it readable is concerned, they did me a favor.
Yeah, I also used to race cars a long time ago, and so I did like a Dick Francis style mystery series with racing, because a lot of things happened in the pit lane that people didn't see, and it was always, you're walking that fine line of, I don't want to basically turn this into a car manual, versus this is the lifestyle, this is the unusual things that happen that you don't see on television.
Well, if it's pertinent to the story, yes, but people are interested in people.
Yeah. But I had one editor who liked that I kept things, if you like, low key on the technical side, And then I had one editor who wanted all the detail, and I had to fight her to say, I think it's like the average reader is not going to want to be interested in 5 pages or whatever.
Well, you narrow down your audience a lot, I think, if you do great detail of technical things. And I worked, and I really resented it when they took it out, but they were right. Because just what happened to the people carried the average reader along. And you want the average reader, when it comes to many, if I were reading something about racing cars, all I need to know is what's pertinent to the story.
Yeah, exactly.
And that is probably most readers.
I do have, because you brought up Charlotte Pitt, I have a question from one of my readers that they wanted me to ask you. And they said, is Charlotte Pitt modeled on anyone, or like a conglomeration of personalities or people or something?
Well, she started out as me and then developed into herself. You've got to identify with somebody.
Yeah.
But I suppose in a way, everybody is a little bit of you, magnified and indulged. I mean, great grandmama, who's a horror, is still a little bit of me. What I don't dare say, but have thought.
I have to agree with that. Everybody I've ever written is some incarnation of me.
Yes. And Vespasia, Great Aunt Vespasia, is an incarnation of what I would like to be like. And I started off with her being nearly 80 years old, and 20 years later, she's only 60. And very few people have bothered to ask me, how old is she really? Do you realize you've gone backwards? Yes, I realize it. She was meant to walk on and walk off, but she walked on and stayed. And now when I'm in the series about Pitt's son, they say, what's happened to Vespasian? She'd be 120 if you're still alive then. You can take a few liberties with that sort of thing. But yes, you've got to feel a little bit of something for everybody. And I've never totally disliked a character that's stayed around, because if they've got nothing recognizable to me, they disappear.
Yeah.
It's fun being a writer, isn't it? You can do all sorts of appalling things, say dreadful things. Not me.
I must say, I do get accused of things. Does anybody sort of like basically connect what you do to, like, because I'll have character or sort of like steal a car or something, and someone will write to me and say, how do you know how to hotwire a car? Is that something you've done? And I'm always surprised that people think of all the different things characters have done. They all kind of think that I've actually done them all.
They don't think I've done those things, possibly because it's historical, but they think I've got one character, Monk, who's lost his memory in an accident. How does it feel to lose your memory? I don't know. He's fictional. And they think I'm doing that to escape some reality. It's just a very good literary device. And no, I've never lost my memory. Oh, I forget things occasionally, but so does everybody else. It's something you do something is a literary device because of the story you want to tell. It doesn't mean you've been there. It means you've imagined it.
Well, I can tell you about losing your memory. I have lost my memory, so I can tell you what that's like.
Is it? I studied it to some extent to make sure I didn't make any major mistakes. But
the only thing I would say is it's never quite how you expect it to be. I think even I kind of like looked into it, and it was interesting. I lost my memory from being hit by a car. Now, I remember the accident very well. I remember that I went to hospital and I had a CT scan. I have no idea how I got to hospital, but the one thing I lost was 6 months of memory after that.
Oh, that's interesting.
So I don't remember meeting people, places, and things like that of that period post the accident. There's some issues around the accident I don't remember, but I don't remember life afterwards. And so I had some awkward encounters with people that I met and had no memory of them. And then the other thing is I still have short-term memory loss. So I may ask you the first question again in 10 minutes, but it was...
Well, I won't remember it, so I'll probably give you a completely different answer.
The main thing is that thing of feeling a thought slip away. Is that if I'm sort of like going, oh, I want to tell you how to boil an egg, and if I'm interrupted or something happens that will distract me for in that moment, I will suddenly forget what I'm doing, forget what the egg is there for, and you can feel it literally seep away, and you're losing a
Mm.
grip on that memory. It's a very weird sensation to have.
I've never heard that before, but then I hadn't heard, I don't know a lot about memory loss. My character who lost his memory lost it completely, and he was having to rediscover himself, which was not always a pleasant experience because he looked at from the outside. And the purpose of doing it was when you're looking at a crime from the outside and you realize that you might have committed it yourself, your view of other people becomes very, very different and a great deal more compassionate.
Yeah, yeah. For me, we tried to. My wife tried to take me to places and try to reconstruct memories,
Mm.
and it's a very disconcerting feeling
Oh,
of.
yes, you've lost control of things to some
Well,
extent.
it's kind of a thing that you'll get a sort of a recollection of something, but not all of it, and it's so random in that sense. But it became very uncomfortable because I got into thinking, and I'm writing something based on this, and it was it's what I call manufactured memory. Is that you just had too many people at one point telling you you were here, we did this, it was, and you
Yeah,
start to go, do I remember it, or am I remembering it because I want to remember it? And
yes.
it became very uncomfortable, and you eventually say, I don't want anything to do with this. If it's gone, it's gone. Let's move on because it's just too weird and.
Well, with my character, there were a few books when it was very dangerous for him because he didn't know who were his friends and who was his enemies.
Yeah,
And he didn't remember his past, and he wasn't all that pleasant a person in some of the past. But then I thought, come on, you're doing this to death. Let go of it.
yeah.
So it's interesting. Even you felt in the situation genuinely. Come on, enough already. Let's get on with the present.
Yeah, it just feels very weird because you're almost a spectator to your own life,
Yes.
and it doesn't, this thing of like, oh, it'll come back or I will find it again. It just doesn't feel right, and you just basically
Mm.
go, if it's, it's like you threw away a
Well, we
favorite
all
book.
forget certain things.
Yeah, yeah,
I've got patches I don't remember, not because I've got amnesia, just because they weren't that memorable, or I don't want to remember.
yeah.
It's when I can't remember where I left something and it matters. Where did I put the car keys? Where the heck is the telephone?
Well, I think you got the right feeling for your monk character on that queasy feeling of not having your memory and having to.
Yes, not knowing what you did
Yeah,
and who likes you and who doesn't and why. But enough already when you've done a few books on that.
yeah, yeah,
Then get into the present. There are all sorts of things to explore, though, aren't there?
yeah. I
And
mean, there's so
repeat
many
parts
topics
of it.
and you never cover them all.
Yeah, no, no. But as long as you cover something that you feel strongly about, if there's no emotion, I won't stay with the story. If nobody learns anything, I have to remind myself that no matter how clever the story is, if there's no journey for the main character, I'm really wasting my time.
Well, it's that thing. If you're not excited about the story, then your reader isn't going to be because you're
It
not going to.
comes through Greyish, doesn't it? Yes, if you don't care, who else will? I get spells when I'm rewriting and I think, oh, enough already. But then afterwards, I'm always glad that they made me do it. They made me. I know perfectly well that they know what they're talking about. I've got very good agents and people who tell me, "Oh, just rewrite it with this shade and that shade and put that
Yeah.
in." But I'm always grateful for it because when I've done it, I think, yeah, that is better.
Okay, I have an off-topic question. It's something I do ask people when I do these things, and that is, I call it my burning building books. It's like
Yes.
if your house was on fire, what three books would you go in and rescue?
Oh, that's difficult, isn't it?
Well, that's the point of the question.
Yes. As much Chesterton poetry as I could carry, and a book that I've written out by hand of all my favorite poems in one. And it would have to be a book that I couldn't easily get again, wouldn't it? I'm not sure about possibly Dante's Inferno, good translation of, because I think that Dante really had it nailed when he showed us that you're not punished for your sins, you're punished by them. If you do something wrong, you may hurt somebody else, but the real injury is to yourself. You asked me a question.
Oh, yeah.
But yes, it will be as much poetry as I can get in 3 books of one sort and another.
Oh, wow. I was not expecting that as an answer. I didn't know what I was going to get, but I wasn't expecting poetry.
Oh, I love poetry. And I used to remember a lot. I remember driving with somebody I knew, was a friend, but didn't know him all that well. And I remembered a poem that I learned when I was about 13, which, believe me, is a long time ago. They told me, Heraclitus, they told me you were dead. They brought me bitter news to hear and bitter tears to shed. I wept as I remembered how often you and I had tired the sun with talking and sent him down the sky. It remains with you perfectly. And that must have been maybe 50, 60 years between learning it and then, but it came back.
That's the power of words.
Yes, the power of words. I can't write poetry worth a darn, nothing like with the magic of the words I can remember. But Chesterton has a poem about when you're young looking for the golden flowers, but then it moves in strange democracy, the million masks of God. And he talks about, and now I'm come to autumn, when all the leaves are gold. There's a happy phrases, lines that come back to you in your mind. It's the furniture of your soul, and it regenerates you, makes you see the beautiful and good again. And the fact that it rhymes makes it a kind of music as well, or rhymes or has meter.
Yeah, there's one thing that I can't do is
no, but I can love what other people do.
Yeah.
I think poets write poetry to enrich everybody. They don't write to say, well, you've got to pay to read this.
Talent for.
I know I haven't a talent for it either. I've just got an ability to love it and find it give me a light to go by.
Okay, I'm going to ask you something else. I'm going to basically I want to ask you this sort of like old favorite question, which is where do your ideas come from, but mainly from themes, plots. Is there something that where do those come from?
Sometimes I don't know, but usually it's from the news or something like that, or looking at a story and thinking, well, I would have explored that person rather than this one. And something that happened because of various events I've heard of. It's a wonderful thing to do something that you shouldn't have done and know that you've been forgiven for it. And I was thinking of that as one of the greatest gifts. I now think it is an even greater gift to forgive. Because if you don't, if you carry around a grudge, that injures you permanently. And if you can forgive genuinely, and so that it doesn't trouble you anymore, doesn't come across your mind, then maybe that's one of the greatest gifts you can be given, the ability to genuinely forgive and forget.
Yeah, I kind of had this conversation a little while ago, because I always said that, if there's any injustice to a person or any crime against a person, someone can always go for jail for it, but there is the weight on the victim, because no one can ever take that punch in the face away. No one can ever take that harm away. So that you have to come to that point where there's the burden of forgiveness on the victim or they're never going to be able to move on. And
yes,
and
everybody has been injured by something or another. Let go of it. because it's you it's hurting
Yeah.
if you don't.
So
It's just something I heard about somebody else, and I thought, well, I think somebody's treated me that way, but I really honestly have more or less forgotten it, because it's within family, these things happen. Let go of it, for heaven's sake, because it will hurt you if you don't.
So would you take, like, say, a modern day story and then transpose it to one of your historical platforms
Yes,
and sort of like,
yes. Almost, if there's a social evil or an injustice or whatever that we've got rid of completely, I haven't heard of it. Almost everything that was bad in the periods I write about, there's an echo of it today, because I'm afraid we don't learn. Those who don't learn history are condemned to repeat it, but even those who do learn history sometimes repeat it,
yeah,
because we don't change that much, and maybe every individual has to learn. Perhaps one or two things we'll get from our parents, but most things we have to learn for ourselves. But it's a big thought. I don't know whether I will ever do it, but I've written a story in which people have to learn to forgive themselves, because sometimes people can forgive other people but not themselves. I mean, it's a big subject, but it's always worth exploring. So are any other subject about human relationships, because they don't change very much. The relationship, with the way the world regards women has changed quite a bit. But we've still got a distance to travel.
yeah, yeah. I was going to say, it feels like things have come a long way, because I think it's 100 years since women got the vote in the US,
Yeah.
and at times it feels like there's still a long, like you say, it's still a long way to go in certain aspects.
Oh yes. I can remember my stepbrother telling me a story about relatives of his, not mine, about a married couple, and she expressed an opinion, and he said, "Be quiet. When I want to know what your opinion is, I'll tell you." Hey, he had no idea why everybody else was laughing. It's there's always somebody who's half a dozen steps behind.
So the next thing I was going to ask you is, and maybe it might fall back on something you've already said, but I basically was going to say, what books have moved you most, and why? It can be
Uh,
your own, or it can be somebody else's.
oh, it had better be somebody else's, hadn't it? Um, One of my favorite books is Chesterton's. It's called The Man Who Was Thursday, and it's basically written semi-poetic prose about 7 different men who represented the days of the week. And they were searching, feeling that each of them felt that he alone was fighting anarchy. And they were actually all fighting the same battle, which they didn't realize until the very end. And I think that often we walk alone when we think we're the only ones fighting a certain battle. And if we only knew it, that everybody else was fighting that battle too, or many other people. Because it's so beautifully written, I could read it many times. But because of its meaning, a book that doesn't make me think, I won't remember long.
Mm.
But anything that makes me think.
So I do think it's an interesting question. Is there something of yours that you? I think there's as a writer, there's always the quest for writing the perfect book between the idea you had and the execution. Is there a book you hold dear as, like, this book that I wrote is special to me?
Yes, it's actually 2 books, but it's a continuous, part 1 and part 2, more or less. I've done a fantasy, which some people it moves very much, but most people don't get it at all. And the first one is called Tathea, Tathea, and the second one is called Come Armageddon. And it's a search for the truth and how different people treat it. But it's an adventure fantasy story. But for example, the magic in it is more allegory than nobody waves a wand and achieves anything. But she escapes with the book that teaches most of the secrets of life. And she and the last person, more or less a disciple, are in a boat, and they're being taken. they think to a certain place of safety, and when they come up on deck, out of sight of land, they realize that they're not going where they were supposed to be taken. And he puts his hand on the shoulder of the helmsman. And when the helmsman turns round, his eyes say that he is one of the unrepentant damned raised for this. And the young man says to Dorothea, we must give them something to make them take us to the right place. And she says, God has offered them eternal life, and they've declined it. What can we offer them? This, we must do something to them then. They're facing eternal darkness alone. What can we do to them? And the idea I'm trying to give is that there's nothing God or the devil can do to you that equals what you do to yourself by your choices. But putting it in a allegorical setting, I think, makes it much sharper than just saying it. And I don't think there's any supernatural power that can exceed your own power to love, to forgive, to have courage, to have humility, etc., or to make different choices. They may not be easy, but they are yours, or ours, or mine. Getting very deep. Wanted to.
Yeah, I mean, I put the question together, and I have no idea where it's going to take us. I mean,
Well, no,
we off on
everybody.
things we wouldn't talk about, but that's fine.
Yes, but in the very end, I had such fun with it, because in the second one, it's Armageddon, and somebody opens hell and lets out the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, my 4 horsemen, which are deceit, and the first one is corruption, and the second one, it's so long since I've read it, but they're my own ideas of what happens to you: corruption, deceit, terror, because terror makes people do some dreadful things. People will do things when they're afraid they would be horrified at when they're not, and in the end, despair. And I think those are the real 4 horsemen, rather than physical danger. It's the corruption of the soul. Getting very deep, but you did ask.
I did ask. I never mind an answer.
I would like to write about the Spanish Inquisition sometime, because of the idea that you've the right to tell other people what to believe. And I did write a book, which I may one day rewrite, and the hero was an inquisitor. And in the end, he decided that everybody has the right to follow their own conscience, as long as they live with the result. And he does it. And of course, he preaches this at the crossroads, and they come for him and burn him, because he's basically saying everybody's got the right to believe according to their desires. And you've no right to tell them or burn them if they disbelieve. And he's therefore preaching freedom of thought, and he gets burned.
Well, it's a dangerous thing to preach.
Oh, yes, yes. But if there's no danger, what are you writing for?
Yeah. So I have one last question for you.
Yes.
And that's what's next?
Oh, carrying on with the 1930s, possibly, well, as far as I should live long enough to do it. If I am in 30, the first was 33 spring, second was 33 autumn, 34 spring I've just done. If I get up as far as the war, but I'm exploring with these difficult decisions, when to accept what is happening and fight for it takes all the courage you can get. You think, well, I would stand up. I'm losing people's names. Very famous priest, German, who said, they came for the gypsies and I wasn't a gypsy, so I didn't do anything. And then they came for whoever it was, and I wasn't one. And finally, they came for me, and there was nobody left to do anything. That one always just about reduces me to tears. But it takes such a lot to do something. And yet people have. Some of the wonderful people, there's somebody whose name I can't remember, but he had an orphanage for Jewish children, Jewish orphans. And when they came to take them all to the gas chamber, he went with them so that they wouldn't go alone.
That's cool.
And they burned him, gassed him. I mean, that sort of heroism is, sorry, gets me every time. That was a real person. That sort of heroism should never be forgotten.
No. Well, thank you for spending the time with us, and I just want
Enjoyed it very much.
and congratulations on being the distinguished guest of honor for Bouchercon.
Thank you very much for helping me to try and fulfill some of its honourable commitments.
Thanks.
Thank you very much indeed for this beautiful award. Any recognition is a great pleasure and a happiness to a writer, but one that comes from those who write themselves, who understand all the excitement and the disasters and the hard work and the rewrites and replans, is the most valuable of all. You know what it's like to get a wonderful idea and think this is going to be the best thing I've ever written, and then you plan it and outline it and start the first sentence. And by the time you've worked it and reworked it and got to the end, you think, this is the best thing I've ever done. And then the criticisms start coming in from your agent or whoever, and you think, well, all right, I'll rewrite this, I'll rewrite that. This has got to be the worst thing I've ever done. And yes, that's a good idea. You do realize I'll have to start from chapter 1 and redo the whole thing. I've found so far that almost always it benefits me to rewrite it as suggestions come. But to get acceptance, belonging from those who do the same job and who understand the triumphs and the disasters, the dreams, it's the greatest reward that you can have and the greatest sense of recognition and belonging. And that's a priceless thing, and thank you.
Hello, I'm Ian Rankin. This is my new book, A Song for the Dark Times. It's about a woman whose partner has disappeared. Her father happens to be a retired detective. He investigates, but is he investigating as a detective or as a parent? And what will he do if he starts to suspect that his daughter may have been involved in a crime? A Song for the Dark Times, latest Inspector Rebus book, except he's no longer an inspector. Out now. Thanks.